Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from, and welcome to our webinar series, Defining and Executing a Successful Global Payroll Strategy. I know we have a very global audience once again on the call today, and I would like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for a session today. My name is Mark Oliver Fiedler. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Payzaar. We are an innovative new startup in the global payroll space. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. I will be hosting today's webinar. If you were able to join us during the first session of this webinar series a few weeks ago, the format is probably already pretty familiar to you. We have about 45 minutes or so of presentation content prepared for today's session, which hopefully will be quite interesting and thought-provoking for you. All the lines have been muted during the presentation to avoid some background noise. If you do have a question during the presentation, please use the chat function, and someone from the team will try to respond to you via chat. We do have some time set aside at the end of the webinar for Q&A, for live Q&A, at which point we will unmute the lines so that you can ask your questions. This webinar is also being recorded, and we will make the recording available to you over the next couple days as well. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now, before we jump into the heart of the discussion of today's session, I did want to give you a few words of background about myself and about Payzaar, especially for those who were not able to join us during last session. If you were, I apologize for the repeat, but for those who haven't met me or us yet, here's a bit of background. So I'm, as I said, Mark Oliver Fiedler. I've been building IT services and enterprise cloud solutions for some of the largest leading technology companies over the past 20 years. I worked at ADP, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, and the Boston Consulting Group. Before launching Payzaar, I was Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Marketing Officer for ADP International. In that role, learned a lot about the challenges of running multi-country payroll operations, which ultimately led to the idea of Payzaar, which we then launched about a year and a half ago. So what is Payzaar? Payzaar is really the first open payroll management platform. Important word there is open. What Payzaar does is we help multinational companies connect and streamline all their international payrolls through one central hub. And fundamentally, what makes Payzaar different and unique compared to some of the traditional payroll solutions is the fact that we let customers keep their existing local payroll solutions in place. So we leverage those existing payroll solutions. You don't need to go and rip and replace your local payrolls, as would be the case with most of the traditional global payroll solutions. So that makes our solution fundamentally more flexible, faster to implement, and also significantly more cost effective. We're very excited about that model, and if you'd like to learn more about our model, about Payzaar, definitely visit our website, which is mentioned here, or also, of course, feel free to reach out directly to myself or to the team. Probably the easiest way is to just respond back to the email from which you received the invite for today's session. So the idea for the webinar series that we're conducting here was really to share some thoughts and insights about some of the key dimensions of formulating and executing a powerful, successful global payroll strategy. Really wanted to talk a bit about what are some of the important things to consider when thinking about defining your strategy and how do you go about assessing different build-out options. And I think we all know that in the payroll world, it's easy to get swept up in the day-to-day fire drills. So we really wanted to take this opportunity to take a step back and look at some of the bigger picture considerations for a global payroll functions. And the way we've structured the webinar series is broken down in 3 sessions. In each of the 3 sessions, we focus on different aspects, and we've called this the why, the what, and the how of global payroll. So in the first session that we conducted at the end of July, we looked at why a global payroll transformation can make sense in the first place, the benefits of consolidating under a global payroll model, and the business case to justify such a transformation. In today's second session, we will discuss what different design and deployment options exist to build out your global payroll model, and we'll look at some of the pros and cons of the different options that are at your disposal. And then in the third session, a few weeks from now, in the middle of September, we're planning to examine how to implement a global payroll solution. So really the execution, the implementation aspects, what are some of the key success factors for getting your global payroll solution up and running smoothly and avoid some of the potential pitfalls in such a big change project. So in today's session, more specifically, what are we going to talk about? This is meant to be a little bit the agenda for our conversation today. So we'll spend time really looking at the what are different design choices for your global payroll model, and what are the trade-offs between these choices. And based on that, what makes most sense for your specific organization. So the flow here is laid out a little bit in the order and the steps in which we believe it makes sense to think through the various dimensions of a global payroll strategy. As you design a strategy, it's very important, of course, to be clear on what you want to achieve, what are your goals and what are your objectives. So we'll start with that first step. Then next, we'll talk about the different operating models and how they can help drive efficiency and value into payroll operations. Next, we'll take a look at the role of technology in all of this and how technology can enable your payroll transformation. And finally, we'll also take a look at various different provider models that can help to support you in that journey. So those are the four main blocks that we've laid out for today's conversation. It's a pretty packed agenda that we're trying to cover here in a fairly short period of time. So let's jump right in. So first step when defining a strategy, and this is not just payroll strategy, this really applies to any strategy, is to start with why. Why change? What are we trying to achieve? What are our goals and our objectives? And these could be a number of different things. Are we trying to reduce cost? Are we trying to improve service and service quality for the organization? Or are we trying to scale the business? And as part of the payroll function, we need to help the organization get new businesses, new entities, new countries up and running quickly. Or are we simply trying to simplify the purchasing contract structures and the vendor environment? So a number of different objectives, and this is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list, just to give you an idea of what some of those objectives could be. So once you define your goals, the next thing that's important then is it's really helpful to be as specific as possible and ultimately to prioritize and really quantify your goals so that we can better determine what kind of levers will be required in order to get there, meaning how big of a transformation will be required in order to achieve our targets. And secondly, we can then also assess, once we start executing our strategy, are we actually hitting our targets, our milestones that we want to achieve? So quantifying our targets, our objectives is the second really important step. Then, of course, as we define our payroll strategy, we know that it's incredibly important to gain the support and the buy-in from senior management, as well as other parts of the organization, IT, finance, obviously need to be tightly involved. So we better make sure, as we're defining our payroll strategy, that our strategic objectives are well aligned with and supportive of the broader company's business strategy. So that's the next important thing to validate. We define our objectives. How do they tie back to the broader business strategy? And finally, once we've done all that, once we've defined where we want to go, where we want to end up, once we've executed our strategy and what the priorities are, we can then also start to assess which aspects of our current payroll model do we want to retain, what works well, and what's already clearly aligned with and supportive of the strategic direction that we want to move in, and what are some of the things that we need to change as we move forward. So overall, starting with clear objectives really will help us in our decisions around various different build-out choices and where we want to focus our effort. So that's the first important step that we wanted to point out and highlight here in terms of the journey of building a global payroll strategy. Now, in order to keep you all engaged, me just talking can become rather boring otherwise, make this a little bit interactive. Wanted to do a quick poll like we've done in the first session as well, and just hear from the audience in terms of your priorities for your global payroll strategy as far as you've defined those. Let us know what are your specific priorities, what are the most important priorities for you. And we've given you a multiple choice menu here: A, cost reduction; B, service quality; C, better compliance; D, faster expansion; E, something else. If there's something else, please let us know what that could be in your specific case. And then also we're interested whether you have quantified those objectives, yes or no. So if you can answer with either a letter and then also yes or no by typing in the chat, and I see already a lot of activity. That's fantastic. I'll give you a moment to find the chat and type in your answers. So I see quite a few multiple answers on multiple drivers, which is no surprise. Obviously, a strategy can have multiple dimensions. Though I would say it's always good to be as focused and have clear priorities as much as possible, so that once you do have to make some trade-offs and tough decisions, your guidance is clear based on what your top priorities are. It looks like we have a good mix of different priorities and also in terms of objectives already being quantified. So so it's nice to see that we have a broad cross representation here on the phone. All right. So next, then, now once we've defined where we want to go, what our objectives are, we now start to look at the operating model itself. And how do we want to run payroll in a global context? And one of the first questions that typically come up when organizations start to look at globalizing their payroll function is, so what should stay local and what should be global? Now, the answer to that question really starts by recognizing that even though in the payroll world, I think we like to say that payroll is inherently local. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because there are so many specific local rules and regulations that apply that require you to have really local expertise. I think it's important to recognize that there are, in fact, once you start to peel back a little bit what's going on, there are many things that are fundamentally similar and apply across countries. So, while, for example, the rules of how we calculate overtime and taxes and Social Security, et cetera, are fundamentally different from country to country, a lot of the underlying activities and processes are, in fact, strikingly similar. So, it doesn't matter which country you look at. You have to collect your data inputs. You have to calculate your gross to net. You have to validate the data that gets generated. You have to process the payslips. You have to produce the payslips. You have to send out the payments. You have to file submissions to government authorities and other stakeholders. You have to create management reports. So all these are things that, while the data itself might be different, a lot of the steps and a lot of the processes and a lot of the tasks that ultimately need to happen are really not that dissimilar from each other. So what we show here in this little matrix is, on the left-hand side of this matrix, we have listed some of the activities and tasks and things that tend to be hard to centralize, simply because they are fundamentally locally specific and locally driven. So for example, the local filings, statutory filings, in many cases obviously require local language, or in some cases even physical presence in order to process the filing. So those naturally would be things that need to still be run and executed locally. But then as you start to look across some of the other elements and activities further to the right, there are, we believe, a lot of activities that can be centralized, that can be standardized. So for example, if you take global reporting, reporting across your payroll, by the nature of things, should be as much as possible set up globally, so you can reconcile your data across different countries. Or workflow and communication tools, it's important to have clear, documented workflows and collaboration, and that is true for all the different activities across the organization. So having a common way of supporting those workflows and communication allows you to start to centralize and standardize those kind of activities. So the idea here, not to dissect every single point on this slide, and certainly some of these things, depending on the context, can move around a little bit. So it's not meant to be entirely prescriptive, just to give you sort of some general directional guidance. But the idea here really is to say, a global payroll model ultimately needs to be glocal, right? This is sort of this buzz term. Certain elements in terms of execution expertise certainly will need to be local and require local capabilities. But then there's a whole range of other activities and other process aspects where it does make a lot of sense to look at them at a more aggregate level and start to look at centralizing and standardizing those kind of activities across the board, across borders. So now when we talk about centralizing a back office function like payroll, that generally means moving activities into shared service structures, which really ultimately consists of bundling similar functional activities across country or business unit borders and moving them into the same physical location in terms of where the team is organized, under the same general management structures, and utilizing the same kind of operating models and tools in order to execute those activities and provide them as services back to the local entities. Now, of course, these days, that's a pretty common way of delivering many back office services. And so what this little excerpt from a study from Deloitte shows is that, in fact, finance and HR functions are the two most common functions that get moved into shared services. They're top two candidates for shared services in most organizations. And since payroll typically is part of either HR or finance, it's indeed quite common to find payroll operating in some sort of shared service setup. And I say some sort of shared service setup because, when you start to look at how shared services are being organized, there's different models, and different organizations will have their own definitions, their own incarnations or implementations of shared services. So, you know, at the most basic level on the far left here, companies have country shared service structures where they bundle everyone belonging to the same functional area within a country into a shared service team. And this can be across different business units or across different local offices where those functions previously resided, and they all then get consolidated into a country shared service center. Operationally, that sort of shared service transformation tends to be fairly straightforward. You know, at least you don't have to deal with complexity of language or time zone or local know-how barriers. So that all tends to be, you know, the same. But then at the same time, once you do bundle things together and move them into shared services, the level of synergies, while it's fairly straightforward to do that, the level of synergies and the impact in terms of cost savings and efficiency gains also tends to be fairly small. So, for example, obviously as long as you move things within the same country, it tends to be no real labor arbitrage opportunities. Economies of scale tend to be not very significant while you're consolidating only at the country level. That changes once you start to look at the consolidation and shared service operations more from a regional perspective. So in this middle model, the model there is to establish regional shared service structures. Could be a European or an Asian or Latin American shared service center. And for many organizations, this is a good starting point. It tends to be a good compromise where you start to get some of the synergy effects in terms of economies of scale and labor arbitrage. For example, by setting up a shared service center for EMEA in a low-cost location like Romania or the Czech Republic, instead of operating out of high-cost countries like UK or Germany or France. And at the same time, you still allow for some of those regional differences, and you have some flexibility by setting up different regional hubs that can operate in their own regional models, which, for example, allows you to keep things like time zone complexities and language complexities to a minimum. And of course, it's also, as long as you're only doing the consolidation at a regional level, it's of course also easier at least to retain some of your existing staff. Moving someone from Poland or from Germany into a shared service center in, let's say, the Czech Republic is probably still a viable proposition relative to trying to move that person from Germany to the Philippines or to India. So there's some of those benefits that come with a regional shared service structures. And a lot of cases, we also see these hubs being clustered around, from a payroll perspective, around areas that have similar payroll characteristics. So, for example, the Nordics tend to have similar payroll regulations and requirements. And so a lot of cases we see that can become kind of a hub structure that makes sense to operate under. And then if you move to the far right, in a way, towards the most advanced state of a shared service setup is really then to build out a shared service organization at the global level. And by doing so, ultimately, that does allow you to achieve fundamentally the biggest synergies in terms of scale effects and in terms of labor arbitrage. Having your entire global team work under the same management structure with the same tools and same processes, of course, creates the biggest level of efficiencies. But on the flip side, that also does require then the greatest level of standardization, and it is a significant operational transformation. So careful change management and moving towards that sort of fully integrated global shared service model is absolutely required. Now, for many organizations, it's not necessarily an either or. You know, in many organizations, we see this kind of as an evolution, as a journey that they move through, and they'll move from typically from left to right, start off with more decentralized structures and move into a cluster approach, and ultimately might end up in a fully centralized global shared service model. So those are some of the design choices, design options in terms of how to set up your payroll function, your global payroll operations. Now, again, curious to get a read on the audience here on the phone. If you can let us know in your world today, in your organization, how are payroll operations organized today? If you can answer through chat, again, A, local level, B, regional, C, global shared service, or a mix. I see a lot of mixes. That's interesting. Fantastic. And a few A's, so a few still at the beginning of the journey in terms of consolidation and centralizing the payroll operations. Okay. Excellent. All right. So that's from the kind of operating model perspective in terms of how to structure, how to consolidate. The next question that we then often dive into that tends to come up is, so, I call this kind of the make or buy question. Do we process payroll in-house with our own team, or do we outsource to a third-party expert? Since payroll is, of course, a back office function, generally not deemed to be a strategic function for most companies, it is rather common to see that companies decide to outsource. However, again, there tends to be no right or wrong answer, but we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of both models. And ultimately, I think it really depends on the very specific situation, not just for the company, but really for the specific country operations, which it boils down to. We'll talk a bit about the two models. So, running a payroll operation in-house, the benefit of that is, of course, it gives you generally more control and more flexibility. Exactly how you operate and how you process your payroll. You're not beholden to the processes and the practices that are stipulated by an external partner. So it gives you some more leeway and the ability to design and craft things exactly to your specific ways of how you like to run things. Typically, it also allows you to avoid the potential redundant structures that we sometimes see emerging when a company outsources to an external partner, where the partner is doing the calculation processing, but within the company, you still need to retain a significant in-house staff to gather the inputs, validate the data, be available to answer employee queries. So we see that sometimes as a challenge in the outsource model, where companies feel that they're sort of paying both internal employees and the external provider, and they have sort of a double cost structure. The downsides of the in-house model, well, of course, it does mean it puts the onus on the customer team, on the organization itself, to stay current with the ongoing changes in regulations, and that can put a significant burden on the in-house team to just stay up to date with all those changes. And the other challenge that we often come across is retention of talent. Payroll is a back office function, tends to, depending on the size of the organization, come with limited upward mobility for the employees. So retaining top talent within that in-house organization sometimes can be a challenge. So you run into issues of employee turnover. And so in those cases, sometimes it's easier and it's advisable to actually look at an outsourced model as a potential alternative. In general, what we see, so there's a little bit of a, I think not a strict, but somewhat size segmentation that we tend to come across, where in-house operations really become economically interesting and viable for entities with larger employee populations. I would say a few hundred up to over 1,000 employees tends to be kind of where the threshold starts, and it starts to make sense to look at a more in-house operating model. Outsourcing, on the other hand, has the benefits that, of course, you do hand off the burden of staying up to date with local compliance requirements to a large extent to your local payroll partner, who will do the processing and the calculations on your behalf. You rely on that expertise that the local partner brings to the table. It also has the benefit that generally you can scale faster, and actually in both directions. If you're expanding, you're growing your team, you can scale up faster, but also in the reverse direction, scale down faster by simply tapping into the expert pool that the provider brings to the table. So there's those benefits to the outsourcing model. On the flip side, the outsourcing setup can be quite expensive. Obviously you pay for the service, you pay also for the margin on top of that the service provider charges you. So that can add up and become more expensive than if you set up your own team. Also for smaller employee populations in a country, it generally makes more sense to hire services, to hire the service of a local expert rather than try to build up that expertise in-house. So, the outsourced model we tend to see being a preferred deployment option, especially for smaller entities with lower numbers of employees. Although I will say we do see cases where we have very large employee populations in a specific part of the organization. And that is being supported entirely through an outsourced model as well, simply because the provision of those kind of skills and the expertise is not deemed strategic to the organization. Fundamentally, again, I think what's important to point out here is both models have their merits. There's really no immediate wrong or right. And what we very often see is, in fact, hybrid models being used across the organization, where companies have both in-house and outsourced models in use. Again, in many cases, that segments itself out a little bit by size of the employee population. For larger countries, companies tend to use that in-house model, and then for smaller populations, where they only have a handful of employees, it really doesn't make sense to hire someone specifically to look after your payroll. But even for those larger organizations, where I think in the 90s and early 2000s, the trend was to really outsource as much as possible because it was deemed not strategic nor core competence. What we've seen over the last few years is a little bit of an interesting trend. I don't have necessarily hard data for this, but anecdotally, certainly come across many organizations that are bringing in some of those outsourced activities back in-house because they want to have more control, because they feel it can be more cost efficient for them to actually insource the activities rather than rely on a third party. So here again, we're curious to learn a little bit about the makeup in the audience, what your current state of affairs is, how payroll operations organized in your business? Is it outsourced? A, B, is it in-house? C, do you have a hybrid model? And then also, I think quite interesting to understand, do you see a shift within your business? Are there any tendencies towards outsourcing more in-house, moving more to in-house, or shift at all. So if you can answer both questions with first one with the letter and the second one with the number, that would be fantastic. Give it a few moments here. That's interesting. So a lot of C's and well, A's and B's mix in terms of what the current status is. What I don't see is what I was just suggesting in terms of anecdotal observation of tendency to move things back in-house. I haven't seen anyone here in this group at least answer with 2 more in-house, which is interesting. So it seems, if anything, it stays how it is, or if anything, it seems to be moving more towards outsourcing. Which is good. Okay. All right. So moving along here. So we've now talked a bit about different ways of setting up your global payroll operations in a global context. Now, independently of whether you've chosen to insource or outsource, or you're setting up your payroll operations in a more country or regional or global shared service structure, there are, we believe, a few important considerations that generally apply and that we believe should inform your global payroll strategy. And we've listed those out here. Number one, we believe you really need to have strong central governance model to allow you to define your key operational elements across your payroll environment. What to standardize, what to keep local, what to move into shared services, what tools to use to enable your operations. And you need this governance model then also obviously to fundamentally control and govern the execution of your payroll strategy. Without a strong governance model, in our experience, payroll transformations will remain patchwork, and you really run the risk of missing out on opportunities to generate synergies and create optimization across the organization. So first important aspect. Secondly, as you centralize and standardize and transform processes in the organization, you need tools. You really need underlying technology that helps to enable these processes. There's no point in moving operations into shared services if the underlying tooling, the systems that people will work with, don't change with that transformation. If you're still using the same tools, you just move people from one location to another, now call it shared services, but they're still working in their same old tools, which are different across that shared service environment. It becomes really, really hard to achieve the synergies, to reduce your core people dependencies, and to streamline the processes and ultimately achieve some of the efficiency gains that fundamentally drive the reason to move into shared service structure in the first place. So you really want to have, alongside your organizational transformation, you want to have the technology that helps you empower that operating model that you're putting in place, that you're moving toward to. And that's especially important in a shared service setup, where you now have tasks that are being done remotely, where you do need to have the collaboration. I talked earlier about that local model. You will still have to have certain things, certain expertise at the local level. But these are now being done remotely, right? Where previously you could have had people working right next to each other or sitting down the corridor, and it was easy to walk over to someone's desk in order to ask a question or resolve an issue. You now have the shared service setup, where by the nature of shared services, things are done in a more remote fashion. And so, that makes it all the more important to enable your processes and support your processes with tools, with systems, with software that help you to facilitate that communication, track where things are and what's really happening across your processes. And then, the next thing to call out here is, of course, as you design your payroll environment, you do want to make sure it's built for scalability. Things change quite quickly. Organizations change. You expand or you spin off parts of the organization, and so you want to make sure that the way you're structuring your payroll operations is built to support that sort of change, and it's easy to add or remove countries from the scope, digest acquisitions as part of the business processes. And finally, you want to retain choice and options regarding the local expertise that you can contract for. So in the case where you don't have that local expertise in-house yourself and you're contracting for an outside expert that helps you with the processing and fulfilling all the local compliance requirements, you want to make sure that you have a choice and options, and you end up in a strong negotiation position, and you don't end up becoming a price taker where you're locked into a specific relationship, into a local contract that then makes it hard for you to get the best money the best value for your money. So ideally, what you want to create is a good level of standardization by leveraging common underlying infrastructures. Standardizing, having a strong standardizing platform, we believe is very important. But at the same time, you want to be open and flexible and retain the choice and keep things competitive so that you do get best service for your money as you're working with providers and partners. So that takes us from kind of the discussion around some of the operating model considerations and choices into our next topic area, which is very exciting, which is technology model. And obviously, in any strategy conversation, technology should play a very important part. It's an important enabler for your global payroll operations. This is a very rich and extensive topic area. Certainly, given the pace of technology evolution, there's constant change and new developments. And speaking for myself, it's certainly a topic that I could spend hours on talking about. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time during this specific session. We are considering actually doing a more deep dive session at a later point in time throughout this year to dive into this whole topic of technology and technology enablement, and how does that help you drive value out of your global payroll operations in more depth. But for this session, what we try to sketch out here, given the limitation of time that we have to cover a variety of different aspects of a payroll strategy, we wanted to just at a high level sketch out some of the key elements and tools that we believe you should investigate as part of your global payroll strategy. We won't have time to go through each of these in great detail, but it starts with if I just kind of go through that list here very quickly, how you manage your workflows and enable collaboration and information exchange between all the different stakeholders that are part of your payroll process, how you load data into your payroll calculation tools, how you validate that data, how you store the data and archive the data, and the documents that get generated as part of your payroll process, how you share the payslip information with your employees in a way that it's easy for them to digest and to understand what they're actually getting paid, and how you can run reports on your payroll data to share that information across other parts of the organization, and fundamentally how you track the compliance, your compliance posture across the organization. So on each of these different elements, we see a pretty broad spectrum of levels of sophistication that companies have in place. And I think the important part here is, as part of your strategy exploration in terms of advancing your payroll to the next level, we think it's very important for you to look at each of these aspects in your own environment, and examine where you stand on these capabilities, on these elements today, and relative to industry best practice and benchmarks that exist, what the opportunities for improvement are. So ultimately, of course, you want to assess how these improvements, the areas of improvement, can support your strategic objectives in terms of cost reduction, in terms of better service quality, in terms of improved compliance, in terms of employee satisfaction. So again, this is just laying out some of the fundamental dimensions of a technology roadmap and technology dimensions at a high level. Hopefully gives you some ideas of what some of those can look like, and what different maturity levels exist. Again, I think this is a topic that's critically important, and certainly from our side here, from the Payzaar team, we'd be happy to engage in a much deeper conversation around those technology aspects of your payroll strategy, if that's of interest to you. All right, so that's on the topic of technology, and then that finally leads to another important topic, that leads to the question of the partnering model, which again, I think is a topic which many of us could probably debate for hours. But the important point here really is that you don't have to build all the things that we just talked about, different deployment options and service structures by yourself. There are providers out there, and I'm sure many of you know many of the providers that are listed here on the page as well, who can support you in that journey, and who have experts, who have infrastructure to support you in your transformation. But as you look at potential partners, vendors that can support you in that journey, in that process, it's also equally important to understand that it is a pretty diverse vendor landscape that's out there, and that segments itself really into fundamentally different provider types. Each of those comes with their own different key capabilities and strengths and weaknesses. So what we try to do here is we try to categorize the vendor landscape the way we see it into 4 different segments, how we think things generally break down between different types of vendors. So number 1, we have the global, it should not say CAP, but global CPA firms, accounting firms. And these are the PwCs and KPMGs and Ernst & Youngs, which all have a broad spectrum of service capabilities, including payroll, but obviously extending way beyond payroll in terms of accounting expertise, tax and compliance expertise. So one of the, I think, very compelling and interesting aspects about these service providers is they tend to have people on the ground, experts on the ground, in many, many different parts of the world. They have offices in most countries around the world, and have strong local knowledge of the local environment, especially as it comes to compliance aspects, and can provide really good and strong advice there. On the flip side, typically what you don't find with these kind of providers as much is they tend to be less integrated and aggregated in terms of their own internal operating models. Most of these organizations function more as local regional partnerships, and I think that is reflected also in terms of how they support the customer organizations. And it's also from a technology enablement perspective more limited. These organizations tend to rely more on manual processes rather than they're not per se software organizations, technology organizations that bring a lot of software technology to the table. The second segment here on this slide is what we call the traditional global payroll outsourcers, so organizations like ADP, who of course just bought Celergo, also fits into this category. Northgate Lorenzo, Ceridian, SD Works, Cloudbase, whole range of providers that I think fit into this category. Now their value proposition, particularly, is focused around the famous one throat to choke value proposition. You get a single contract, you get a single global price point, you have a single point of contact to help you resolve issues, and that provider helps you to aggregate and consolidate your operational aspects of your payroll model. On the flip side of this model, what's important to point out there to understand is that these models tend to be rather rigid and inflexible. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if you want to bring in certain existing vendors into that model where you have a good experience with the local vendors that you're currently working with, that tends to be not part of that model. It's not supported in these vendor-specific model. They have their own vendor structures and ecosystems that they bring to the table, so they require you to switch and rip and replace your existing local solutions and replace them with the solutions that are part of their network. They also, in terms of flexibility, they don't tend to support an in-house model. So if you operate in a hybrid environment and you want to run certain parts of your organization through an in-house model, typically that's not supported as part of the global payroll outsourcers operating model. So you have to outsource to them. The third category we call the niche outsourcers, a little bit for lack of a better term. So what represented in that category are aggregators that manage a network of local partners and payroll operations on the customer's behalf. So you don't have to worry about finding and setting up local payroll partners and local payroll operations as you internationalize your business. Typically, the way these guys operate is, again, in a more kind of manual, service outsourcing model. There tends to be less technology at play, less automation at play. That's sort of how that model is set up. You don't get a ton of aggregation across your payroll environment when you work with these kind of vendors. And then the last model, last but not least, and certainly we have a clear view on this model that we're talking about here, is what we call the open platform model, which is really a model that we're looking to pioneer as a fairly new player in the global payroll space. And fundamentally, what distinguishes this model from the other options that we've laid out here is the fact that it's designed from the outset to be very flexible and really allows you to leverage your existing payroll solutions. So you don't need to swap out all your local payrolls that you've already invested in, and still allows you to benefit from the aggregation and from streamlining the operations across those existing payroll solution, payroll partners that you're working with. That model is also flexible. in terms of supporting both in-house and outsourced operations as well. And I think the second point to make here is because this is a new model that that's being built out. It's being built from scratch based on state-of-the-art technology and not with kind of the traditional outsources mindset, which tends to try to address challenges more with throwing more people at the problem. So Payzaar certainly as part of that category, we fundamentally pride ourselves on the technology and the automation that we can bring to the table, and helping to really leverage the power of technology to take your payroll operations to the next level. So these are some of your vendor choices. Again, this doesn't have the claim to be absolutely comprehensive, but I think it lays out some of the fundamental options that exist out there in a structured manner. While we from our side here probably have a little bit of a bias in terms of where we think some of the attractive parts in this picture are, I wouldn't proclaim that there is a clear right or wrong. I think all of these different models have their fundamental merits, and ultimately what I would say is it really depends on your specific priorities, your objectives, what you're trying to achieve with your specific payroll strategy and with your payroll solution, and what your starting point is, and that will guide you and point you into different directions, different support models that exist out there. So that brings us kind of to the end of today's session. I know we're coming up to the end of the hour here, so just very quickly then in summing up, we realized we covered a lot of ground today. We started talking about why it's so important to start with clear objectives and goals that guide you in your choices around different deployment options. We talked a little bit about those different deployment options from an operating model perspective, in terms of shared service structures, regional and global, in-house versus outsourced. We also talked about some of the technology dimensions, which are very important enablers of that strategy, and certainly play a big role in should play a big role in defining your strategy. And then finally, we talked a bit about the fact that there are, of course, vendors and partners out there that can help you on that journey, that transformation that you're setting out to do, and each of those different vendor models has their own merits and needs to line up with your specific needs. And finally, once you've gone through that exercise, you've defined your strategy, and you've set your destination where you want to take your organization, then comes the fun part of really focusing on the execution. And that, of course, is a big endeavor in and of itself. And so, which is a great transition to just making a little bit of promotion for our next webinar, which is coming up on September 13th, which will focus exactly on that part of that journey, is how to execute. What does a great implementation for global payroll strategy look like? And we'll get into some of those specific aspects of gaining support and buy-in from the management, how to set up project structures for an efficient, successful rollout, the change management aspects of that, and how to work with the vendors in that process. So, so with that, let me wrap this up then and turn it over at this point to Q&A. If folks on the phone or on the line here have a few more minutes, we'd be happy to take your questions or comments. I will unmute the lines, or actually what you need to do is, if you want to ask a question, click on the little microphone icon that should be on the bottom left of your screen. And then your line should be open so we can hear you and you can ask your question. Do we have anyone who wants to go first? It's always the tough one, first question to go. Someone trying to talk. I seem to see someone who's... If you're trying to ask a question, you just need to click your microphone button at the bottom of your of the Zoom meeting screen. Someone trying to ask a question, then maybe just write it in chat, because I can't hear. It seems like someone's trying to talk, but I can't pick it up. Let me see if there's a technical issue here. I'm going to try to unmute everyone for a moment at the risk of creating a lot of noise and feedback, just to see if someone's having a problem getting off the mute. Just give me 1 second. All right, so now everyone should be unmuted. So if you're still on the line and if you were trying to ask a question, you should be able to speak now. No, maybe it was just noise on the line and not a question. All right. Well, maybe we were so clear today that there are no questions, or I could imagine that there probably are a bunch of questions, but they could be quite specific to your specific situation, in which case, if you want to ping us subsequently after the webinar and talk more about questions you might have about your specific situation, definitely feel free to reach out. Best way to get a hold of us is, you can see here on the screen, info@payzaar.com. Those emails will reach us and we'll respond to them promptly. All right, very good. Well, I realize, we've gone a little bit over our time here by a few minutes. So I do want to thank everyone once again for taking the time to spend this hour with us. Hopefully you found the session useful and informative. We'd love it if you can join us again for the third webinar in our series on September 13th. We'll make sure to send out reminders. If you haven't already registered, please do so. Go to our website, www.payzaar.com/webinars, and you'll find the registration page for that webinar as well. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Talk to you soon.